amazing event is most welcome to. And you get to take the order around as necessary. I'm Richard Spear, the Secretary of the Board of Hickory Cluster, and this is a function at which we are going to talk about Hickory Cluster's amazing past and the people who started it up. But we're going to be talking about the past in the context of an exciting present and a future that we hope we can catch. It is on, but well, okay. There we go. 1 inch away from the mouth. As you all know, we are in the last 4 days of a pledge drive to raise $500,000 to be matched by Millennium Bank to make the revitalization of our cluster possible. If we fall 1 penny short of the $500,000, about half of our pledged money is conditional and it goes away. So right now, as of this moment, we are up to $422,000 in pledges. We need 7 full pledges in the next 4 days to make this happen. If anyone is inspired by what he or she hears today, I have some pledge forms right on the edge of the table. And you can come up and either pledge or upgrade your existing half pledge to a full pledge. When you do so, you can take one of these. This is a poster that says, "I pledged or prepaid." And if you put it on your door or your window, it will protect you from the Hickory Cluster Board of Directors. Now, we are immensely fortunate to have here to kick off our discussion, our new supervisor-elect. Without further ado, I'm going to invite Kathy Hudgens to talk to all of us. Welcome.
Thank you. I keep reminding people it still says supervisor-elect because since November 2nd I've been very fortunate and very proud to be very busy in the community. And but I always say to people that we still are in a transition period. But I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be here part of, as mentioned before, the pledge drive that you're in, because I think that is a very commendable effort, and I know the effort that you've had over the past 1.5 years in terms of addressing the problem in Hickory Cluster, and need to commend you in taking the effort to do your own work in addressing that and encourage you in doing it. I want to just give you a piece and let you know that I'm very familiar with Hickory Cluster. I've been in this community for 30 years, and I tease people and tell them that on a good day when I have an opportunity to walk, I live off of Wedge Drive, and I take my walk around and come back to Lake Ann, and I go under the path and I walk behind Hickory Cluster. And once when I was going through the campaign and one of the reporters asked me what was I talking about when I had some concerns about some changes of character in the community, and I said, I wish I could take you on a walk with me. And in taking you on a walk, you could see all of the great things that we do care about this community and why we want to be careful as we change and we retain much of that. And Hickory Cluster is one of those places. It not only holds a historic piece for us, but it does set in foundation a basic of some of the architecture that has been so important to us in Reston here. In understanding the problems that you faced over the past 1.5 years, I come out of Chairman Hanley's office, so I have some immediate understanding of what the concerns have been. And I know that you have been attempting to work with Fairfax County. And as the new supervisor, I am anxious to get involved and continue a working relationship. I know that what you are trying to do is most important, that you do it right now for your own success in your community. So I encourage you to continue to be vigilant on that. I look forward to working with you on any following problems that you have. On the issue of revitalization, you are sort of at the cusp of the residential revitalization issue, and that it is very important that we learn, and in a sense we have learned from your own experience what we face, and most importantly that we learn how the community feels about the areas that need to be revitalized, and that we are conscious of what your concerns are in what has to happen in your own community. As the supervisor, I want to make sure that you understand that I am here to listen and understand what your concerns are, and hope that I can then work on the board with the members of the Board of Supervisors to address those kinds of concerns. I look forward to working with you, and we have a meeting coming up very soon in which I will have an opportunity to look and talk in more detail about what maybe some of your concerns are. But most importantly, I'm anxious to be here for this, because I can only say it for a short time, but I'm anxious to hear again, one, the history and some of the grand ideas that may come forward here in addressing the problem of Hickory cluster, and I hope problems that we can fold in to other issues of revitalization in Reston per se, but Hunter Mill District as a larger sense. Thank you very much for having me. I want to leave a piece about that sign in the window. I used to be a PTA president, and I'm sure they probably still do this, but we used to do the sign piece about giving children the signal as to where to go, where the safety place is, where you run. I don't know if they still do that. I may be dating myself. But for walkers, you always need to know where is the house of refuge if the children have a place to go. Well, I hope that sign isn't just about refuge. I hope it's about when you've really gotten to that point where you reach that goal, and that you're at 100% of what your pledge needs to be, because I think you really need to be very vigilant about that. And I would look forward to being able to say that, you know, Hickory Cluster has really done their own work when I go back to Fairfax County to talk about what we can do in concert with you. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to working.
We've got about 5 minutes for Ms. Hutchins to take any questions. Would anyone have any? Well, I think you answered them all in advance.
That's it. Richard, we have a...
Without going into a lot of detail, could you tell us perhaps what one thing might be that you could do in concert with us? I mean, what you would think?
Well, the question was, could I, not to go into too much detail, but tell one thing that I could do. Let me step back from that one, because I have to tell you that I need to make sure that I am not moving from what is partial information versus full information. But I am going to be meeting with the Director of the Housing and Community Development, because I would like to know all of those steps that have taken place, and then to continue to examine what opportunities exist. But of course, to me, the immediate thing is what you're doing right now, and that is most important for us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Hutchins. We're really honored to have you here. Now, let's move into the reason we're all here, which is the story of our illustrious past. Anyone who looks at any part of Hickory Cluster immediately realizes that something is very wrong. Here we are in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Old Dominion. Where are the 2-story high Greek columns on either side of our front door? Where are our 2-car garages with automatic garage door openers? Where are our zillions of teeny tiny windows, our gables, our pointed roofs? Where is the veranda where we can sit in our rocking chairs and supervise the hounds on the grounds? As a matter of fact, where are the grounds? Where are our fenced yards with acres of green grass? Clearly something is wrong, and we're looking forward to having our distinguished panel of speakers tell us what went wrong and whose fault is it. Our three speakers plus moderator are as follows. We have Robert E. Simon. In case you were sedated for the last 35 years, the name Reston has something to do with the initials Robert E. Simon. We have Maria Wayne, an architect for the firm of Charles Goodman, who is responsible for the site design for Hickory Cluster. We have Carl Ingebrigtsen, founder of Link, the information service for our mass transit in Reston, and a pioneer homeowner in Hickory Cluster. And to moderate this, we have the Dean of the School of Architecture at Catholic University, who's a great fan of our architect Charles Goodman. It's Dean Gregory Hunt. I'll now turn the floor over to Dean Hunt.
Thank you very much. I can only begin by saying that you know that there's a special quality about a community which has this kind of event, not in a stuffy, windowless lecture hall or room, but in this fine, fine space. It really does say something about the uniqueness and special quality that this community brings to all of us, and we're all grateful for it. I've been asked to give a brief introduction and then go through a series of questions and answers and discussions. And I'm going to do so in two parts. I'm going to read you a little introductory series of thoughts that I think tries to say something about the bigger picture within which Hickory Cluster has developed over time, and then something of the actual origins as related to us in the architectural press in 1965. As we end the 20th century, it is fitting to recall significant achievements from which we have all benefited and of which we may all be proud. We have of late been hearing about achievements in the areas of medicine, sports, science, politics, and the arts, to name but a few. But it is perhaps most fitting that we remember those significant achievements in the areas of environmental planning and design as well. For these are the areas that profoundly affect how we work, how we live, how we shop, recreate, etc. In other words, they significantly impact the context in which we live out our lives. The paucity of good remembrances in this area is indeed to be noted, mostly I would suggest, because we simply do not have an abundance of noteworthy accomplishments in this area as a whole. Enlightened development by creative individuals with vision and courage has really not been the norm in this country. The results of conventional speculative building and rapacious suburban sprawl need not be described here, as each of us knows all too well, particularly as residents of Northern Virginia. Unfortunately, the legacy of this kind of development continues, as does the short-sightedness and greed that sustains it. But we have also been fortunate to have had some individuals that have approached land development and the creation of livable, meaningful communities guided by optimism and a strong belief in using a different approach. Today we gather to recollect and honor such an approach. With the founding of Reston, Virginia in general, and the building of Hickory Cluster in particular, we were given some important new directions, and as with many milestones, it is always fruitful to probe their beginnings, sift through their histories, and identify their important contributions. Hickory Cluster, of course, is but one part of a greater whole, a larger vision concerned with land planning, residential density, the creation of community, and suburban living in general. To understand this larger picture within which the story of Hickory Cluster begins, evolves, and presently exists, I offer you the following passages from an article titled "Progress in Planning. A New Town Brings Urban Living Patterns to the Countryside," that appeared in the July and August 1965 issue of the Architectural Forum magazine. And I quote, "Multifamily housing is bound to play an expanding role in the development of the open land around our metropolitan areas. The enormous increase in the population of suburban America in the next few decades just cannot fit into single-family subdivisions. The new town of Reston, Virginia was conceived as an alternative to suburban sprawl, as a pattern for low-density development. Its dramatic confrontation of high-density housing and rural landscape recalls some of the new towns in Britain and Scandinavia. Unlike its European relations, however, Reston is not being built as part of a national program for population redistribution and social improvement. It is being built by a private developer, Robert E. Simon Jr., in the hope of profit. Reston is of great value as a proving ground for physical planning and design concepts, for patterns that could be applied to other low-density areas. In established communities, untried alternatives to conventional patterns are thwarted by existing improvements, accumulated regulations, and private interests. In a new town like Reston, unconventional concepts can be given a fair test in terms of American economics. While the economic success of Reston remains in doubt, this is 1965, just as the project was undergoing its start, the success of the physical form is now becoming apparent. As the first stage of construction approaches completion, Reston already has more spatial interests than all but a few American towns. It's a rather remarkable statement. Has more spatial interest than all but a few American towns. It has a sheltered plaza opening onto a tree-rimmed lake. It has public stairs, elevated walks, and caves. It has picturesque skylines and broad vistas unfolding at the ends of narrow passages. In short, it has the richness of townscape that every subdivision lacks. And it goes on to say, but this richness has been achieved at the sacrifice of the cherished feature that every subdivision offers, a private castle for every family. In order to win public acceptance, the design of Reston had to appease the American desire for independence. I'm going to end my quote from that article in the Architectural Forum and now pose a question, of course, to the original founder, Robert Simon. How did you arrive, then, in contrast to the typical American subdivision, Mr. Simon, with the concept of clustered development? Because without clustered development as an idea about land use, Reston, of course, would not have existed in its beginning.
Sure.
How about that? Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Very good. Interestingly enough, in a time when a neighboring county, I should remember which, is banning townhouses because they are so destructive of the landscape, we went to the townhouse mode as our major residential unit to save trees and the landscape. The misguided people in the county who banned townhouses didn't realize it wasn't a townhouse that was guilty, it was the density. So that, as you probably know, you're living in a density of about 6 to the acre, and you all live in a forest. If you do 6 single-family detached houses to the acre, each little castle unto itself with its 2-car garage, there are not many trees left.
We'll just see how this evolves, but my next question spins off of that in the following way. The initial 3 sections involved the commissioning of 3 particular architects, Charles Goodman, Cloughill Woodward Smith, and Whittlesey and Compton. Now, Whittlesey and Compton, as I understand it, have done the master plan for us. Is that correct?
We started off with Bartholomew. That was the largest planning organization in the country. They had 200. They had 200 resident planners out in St. Louis. The team that they gave us didn't seem to work out, so I got a hold of Bill Conklin and asked him to do a little project that we had in Long Island, just to see if we could work together happily. And it turned out that we could, and so Whittlesey and Conklin soon turned into Conklin and Roseanne. But it was kind of dumb of me not to think of them first, because they were the ones who were responsible for Radburn in New Jersey, which was the first, as far as I know, movement toward a new town in this country. It started in 27. The Depression cut it off at the knees, but what's left there is a model for a lot of organizations. 300 units, separation of pedestrians and vehicles, and a community center. It's there today if you want to go to Radburn. So they had gone from Radburn on to some other things. Clarence Stein had been the one who started it, and then brought in Mayor, and Mayor brought in Whittlesey, Whittlesey brought in Conklin. Our intention was to have a variety of flavors. The idea being that if we just had one kind of townhouse, it might not appeal to somebody. So by having 3 different architects do 3 different clusters from day one, there's quite a range. I look at Conklin Roseanne townhouses here as modern Gothic, and Clotilde Smith Waterloo cluster as a contemporary adaptation of what had been going on in this country. And Chuck Goodman was taking his cue from Scandinavia, as far as I knew, and Mondrian. And this gave a pretty wide spectrum. The idea of townhouses in the boonies was something the bankers took a very dim view of. And we actually went through so many bankers who said no that we started Hunter's Woods simultaneously, on the theory that maybe all these bankers had been right and we were going to have a bust up here. And so to have the community continue, we started with a typical approach, large lot subdivision down in the south. I'll end by telling you my favorite story of the banker who I had known for some time. And he said, "Bob, why in the world are you doing 227 spec townhouses? Why don't you build one and put it next to the sales center and see how they go?"
I'm in the awkward position of keeping one of the panelists from eating hot, I don't know what kind of fish this is, but courtesy prompts me to move to Maria Wayne then. I will come back to Mr. Simon, but I want to have some of his food. Maria, since you were working with the site plan with Chuck Goodman in his office, what were the major challenges, would you say, and how did you think the office dealt with them? How did it arrive at the particular site plan that it did?
Well, the major challenge was handling really the drainage system around the clusters without disrupting the countryside. And I must start with something which might seem irrelevant, but eventually turn out to be of major importance. We moved to Holland Hills in '53, and this was all farmland all around, with plenty of natural soil for percolation of rainwater and snow and everything else. And a couple blocks below us, there is a lovely stream called Wall Spring, which had nice mossy banks with lots of violets and native deciduous azaleas and even fringe trees, Virginia fringe trees, if you know what it looks like, it's lovely. And we used to go there collecting wild mushrooms and with lots of kids from the neighborhood giving a nature walks. And as Holland Hills grew, they started emptying the storm sewers right into the creek. And that's when the trouble started. Right, serious erosions right at the outlets of the culverts. And then as the countryside around was paved over more and more, there was more of this flooding going in. And Fairfax County finally said, okay, we will decorate the banks with riprap and some big rocks, and so there went the moss and there went the flowers, and it started to look like an urban sewer with all kinds of junk in there, and just lost of its charm. And that's when we were faced with how to handle similar situation right in Reston. You have that nice creek there, and so county at the time, they didn't have any idea how that they even had a problem with storm sewer handling. And of course, they were accustomed to plow every tree down they could get hold of, and riprap was their solution. So we will riprap the creek. And so we suggested, how about building a retention pond system to slow down the floodwaters and eliminate the erosion. So, and since it was cheaper than anything else, they decided, yeah, that's a good idea. So they went along, and so you were lucky recipients of our experience in Holland Hills, and you ended up with some low years, and I understand that unfortunately your expectation was of a series of grandiose little lakes which the water supply really, the natural water supply couldn't maintain. But at least you didn't have this problem of erosions, major erosions, and having trees undermined by floodwaters. So, and the county, I noticed that they started using this ponding system in other areas where there was no major density of housing. So that was the result of your park system there, and nice walks around the creek.
Let me just interrupt for a moment and extend that a little bit. I'm and also a fellow resident of Holland Hills, designed by Charles Goodman, which was actually site planned in 1947. And its relevance here, I think, in addition to what Maria just pointed out, is that Goodman took, in 3 or 4 occasions, the major drainage swales, that is to say, the natural configuration of the land where all the ground runoff would accumulate, and converted them into parks, basically designated them on the site plans as community parks. And to this day, they remain as really critical open spaces in our community as well. So one can see that these natural features, when dealt with by, I think, a sensitive land planner / architect, really can become amenities quite readily. And it's unfortunate that that's not done more often today. So I think it's a very fitting anecdote that Maria has shared with us about this particular cluster. Now, one of the things, Maria, I wanted to approach you with as well is the architecture, clearly, of this particular set of clusters. And again, remember the cluster zoning in many states was really coming in later than even in Reston, as I understand it. But it does take the idea of density, and by placing houses on the land in a very specific way, retains a great deal of open space to be shared by everyone. And of course, that's something you all enjoy here, and it's quite readily seen. But in the Washington metropolitan area at this particular time, in the early 60s, precast concrete beams and concrete block piers was not the normal vocabulary of construction and of design, as you all know. These were radically different buildings, radically different. Now, leaving aside problems of flashing and of the kinds of things that all experiments necessarily entail, and we shouldn't really forget that anything that's an experiment, as it is in science, has its pluses and has its minuses. We all acknowledge that for sure. But what I'm going to get at is, Maria, in the office, what was the reason, do you feel, that Chuck Goodman went to this kind of experimental structure in Reston?
Well, Chuck was a great innovator, and he always liked to experiment with new things. And Clocky Smith cluster preceded him, and so he said to us, "We have to do good and better than Clocky." So there was a great rivalry, between these two offices. So he certainly wanted to get away from the wood, and he had enough wood design behind him, so he wanted to try the concrete structure and more urban appeal to design than it would give him wood. And in addition to that, he thought that it would be easier to maintain a concrete and brick structure than in a wood structure. Not mentioning, of course, that fire safety is much greater than you get with wood in a cluster buildings. Which is a major consideration if you have got a tight packed structures next to each other. So that was, I think, the major concern, but also big indifference that played a pretty important role.
I'd like to switch to Mr. Simon if I can get you to just have a complete swallow. So, forgive me. But it's a question that really should have preceded this one, but nonetheless I'll pose it now. You gave marching orders to each of the architects. How much freedom did you give Goodman in the design of this particular cluster?
I thought that in our picking these architectural firms, I had gone as far as I needed to go. And I did give them a kind of a freedom that some people thought was almost ridiculous. But the thing is, we were looking at the entire picture, and it seemed to me that since we had distinguished architects, we should let them go. In retrospect, it would have been easy enough to have what they call focus groups prove out that your houses would be tough to sell, and they were. They are the best houses of the three groupings in terms of the interiors. The exteriors don't appeal to the vanity button, which was the problem. So that these particular houses, your house is sold slower than the others. But you benefited, certainly, by the interior being the best designed. Clotilde Smith's houses had rather poor kitchens, and this was astonishing since she was a woman, and everybody knows a woman's place is in the kitchen. The only thing about Clotilde is she didn't cook. So a lot of the Waterview cluster people have done something to remedy that. I can't, Kathy, I can't skip this opportunity to be irrelevant, which is the way you guys handle embarrassing questions. To tell you that our moment of truth, we were faced with 7, not 9 supervisors. And it was a very tense period where we were going to get our license to go or not. Years later, looking backward, of the 7 supervisors that we were dealing with, 6 had been indicted. And 5 had served jail sentences. So Kathy, you're in a different era altogether.
Let me go. The kitchen spawns a reference to an article I happen to have a copy of in the Thursday, April 16, 1970 Washington Post, which recounts the visit of Jane Drew, one of Britain's most popular architects at that particular time, who visited Reston to evaluate America's new towns. And I'll quote, "I've lectured about the efficiency, the beauty of your kitchens all over England," she said. The president of British Architectural Association, sounding as if she had been betrayed. "And then you concoct this phony romance," says she. She's visiting one of the units now in Hickory Cluster, apparently. She gave the back of her hand to a swirly, antiquated cabinet handle and continued, quote, "I'd like to warm up the Formica with wood, but I don't like to see these things, dirty, folksy little handles. Can you imagine trying to clean these things?" And she goes on talking about the handles. But in the end, she said, she pronounced a cluster of Cubist-inspired Charles Goodman townhouses excellent, and said of the new town's architecture and site planning as a whole, several times, it's absolutely superb. Now, we talked about kitchen cabinets and curb appeal. Let's go to one of the early home buyers and ask, why did you buy in Hickory Cluster?
Well, we were first introduced to Reston through the famous Look magazine article, which was a promotion of Reston. We lived in Concord, Massachusetts at the time, in a house, a very conventional one-story house with small windows, and a very nice kitchen, I should say, a place to garden and so on. So, but we've been in Washington, living in Washington. We were first married and lived in Cleveland Park, and we considered the Virginia suburbs absolutely boring. But we saw this Look magazine article, and we thought, hey, Reston sounds very exciting. This was October of 1965, and in a very real sense, it was a return for both Shirley and myself to the past, because we'd both grown up in communities where we could walk to work, where our kids didn't have to be buzzed to school. We walked to school. We walked to shopping. The to us, it looked like Simon's dream was, in modern architecture, really was a return to the past. And so we, with that thought, came to Reston. I came to Reston and looked at, went all over Northern Virginia looking at housing. It was very depressing. Indeed, with a excellent Shannon and Lux agent, I remember, at the time. And we looked at some houses. We looked at the Waterview cluster, and also had not seen a house in Hickory cluster, but I did see was shown by the salesman, Reston land salesman, Woody. I've forgotten what his last name is. Shirley maybe would remember, but at any rate, we saw the Burlington Fabrics model house, which is a 1,500 square foot house at the entrance of Hickory cluster, just 2 stories, and it had marvelous big windows. You looked out the windows and you didn't see another house. We looked out toward our favorite piece of architectural sculpture, the high rise, where Bob Simon now lives on the 13th floor, and we had a private patio. We had a very nice kitchen, big rooms, great big rooms with lots of light, and to me it looked like a dream come true. We were looking at, we could send our daughter to the Lake Ann Nursery Kindergarten up above the Safeway here in Lake Ann. She could walk from the house, go down through the Hickory Cluster underpass and make her way to the Lake Ann Nursery Kindergarten. We could shop, carry our groceries home from the Safeway here at Lake Ann, and we looked ahead to the time when Christine would be in school at the Lake Ann Elementary School. To us, it looked like a perfect world, and we were very, very happy for a number of years.
Are there any other first owners in the audience? Just out of curiosity. Would you care to comment on? Okay, anybody else that came in early?
Since Ron gives me the opening, I'd like to say that every time I see him, I remember the early days of Reston when we were struggling with our tennis group. And I took one look at him and said, "How's your tennis game?" And he said, "I don't play." Well, that was not a satisfactory answer for somebody of this build. So Ron and I were on the tennis court fairly soon thereafter, and the rest is history. He's now an avid tennis player.
I just wonder if anybody else that, well, some of you have, obviously all of you have moved here at one point or another. I'd like to just, yes.
In 1970, a house was being used for people who were buying these tract houses in the southern part. And they were occupying it until it was finished. And they were hard to sell, therefore they were parking in these houses. And one of the reasons, I always liked the architecture, the main reason being from New York, was they were selling at 1967 prices. So, we've been there ever since.
Yes, sir.
My wife, Maria, and I moved here in March of 1967. And we moved down from Syracuse, New York. I read about Reston in the urban planning literature, but my mind was not focused on that. It happened to be that I was working at the Washington Council for Governments and sharing an office with a fellow by the name of Jim Sales. And he knew that I was hunting for a house. And he said, "Well, why don't you try Reston?" He said, "I take my dates out there, and they pack a picnic basket, and then we go walking through the woods, we rent a boat, and we canoe on the lake." And he said, "Your children will probably enjoy that." I then decided to take him up on that, and I must tell you that as soon as I drove into Reston, I was turned on, although everything was in construction. And I said to myself, being an urban planner, I should live in a community like this before I try to spring it on other people. How we got to a Hickory cluster, I was very impressed that it was strategically located and that one could walk to just about everywhere. 1 block from Lake Ann Elementary School, a half a block from the swimming pool, a half a block from the volleyball court, the tennis court. As Carl pointed out, Lake Nursery, the pre-school over the Safeway, so my daughter could also walk there. Everything was really within walking distance. And of course, at that time we had the Safeway, and it was really, but I must say that even though everything was within walking distance, it was difficult for us as a family to be weaned away from the automobile. And very often we found ourselves driving, for example, to the village center. So, but
The American dilemma.
yeah, the final thing was that the community appeared to me as a recreational community, an all year round recreational community. And I said to myself, this might sound kind of silly. I said to myself, well, gee whiz, I won't have to take my family on summer vacation because we are actually living in the vacation land.
Well, we were saying at the table, that's a wonderful testimonial. And of course, we did have a community center, as some of you know, and most of you don't know, right here. Actually, it was over there where the hair company is, I believe. Is that right, Carl?
Common ground.
Well, before the common ground, by several years, there was a 5,000 square foot community center. And the concept of that was that this would be a seed bed where the community as it grew could determine where it wanted to go and what special facilities needed to be constructed to meet needs. So in that community center, we had meetings, we had 3 kinds of dance lessons, tap dance, ballet, and modern. And there were sculpture classes, and there were movies. I got to pick them for a while, and that was wonderful.
With popcorn.
So this was verging on becoming a community. And if people want to know the difference between a village center and a shopping center, all you've got to do is look at this. This is a village center. Unfortunately, we don't have any others in Reston. But there are some Celebration, which is a Disney product.
I want to make 2 comments about the handouts, and I hope you all get them, that perhaps pick them up at the door. This little site plan. And I want to ask Bob Simon, on the plan it notes, in addition to the footpaths, a music and dance pavilion, for example, in the center of the complex. Were those not built for some particular reason? I hope I'm not treading on thin ice here, but I have nothing to hide.
Well, I think that this original sketch for your cluster had a lot of fantasy involved in it. and some of it was counter to our approach. We didn't picture that kind of thing in a cluster. We picture that in a village center.
Thank you. Also on the plan is something that I think is enormously important about both the developer, Mr. Simon, and the architect, Mr. Goodman, because you notice at the top the number of different unit types. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but as you walk through this complex, you might take note of it. I'm sure you all have, perhaps unconsciously. But what's extraordinary, I think, is the answer to the question of why so many. It's usually considered to be much more economical to have 1 or 2 units and simply just reproduce them. Just flip them over left to right. You stagger them, push them in 3 or 4 feet, and you're done. You only have to do a few contract documents as an architect if you're finished with the job. Why would an architect and a developer ever want so much variety? I think the secret lies in Goodman's passion for understanding or having a great sympathy for variety in human life and in human living. And in an article called "This is Reston" from the Home Furnishings Daily, October 9, 1964, he wrote, and I quote, "In such a community, it is possible to play musical chairs, to move from one house to another depending on the increasing or decreasing size of the family. In this way, you build up certain ties, a certain continuity. You don't exclude people. You include elders. Towns exclusively for senior citizens are vicious and unreal. People have always been attracted to cities because they are full of life, all kinds of life, not restricted to certain ages." I'd like Maria Wayne and actually each of the panelists to comment on that, I think, because it's one of the underlying, I think, values and great enriching qualities of this particular community.
Yeah, I think this was the nature of Goodman, and whatever he built, that he expected that people could stay around and grow and diminish with the community. We can experience it in Holland Hills. Now our street has become a geriatric street. It started as it's true. It started as a street full of children, dog packs, everything. And the houses grew with the families being added to. One house below us, it looks like a Chinese pagoda, one pavilion over each other. And when the families, some families just moved to a bigger house higher up over the street. Now the old folks, little by little, are having to move because they cannot drive. Unfortunately, that's the sins of Holland Hills. We have to drive to get to our shopping and whatnot. This is the blessing you have in the major development, that you really have got walking distance to all the facilities. So you count your blessings.
Yeah, well, Chuck was talking about one of the very fundamental principles of this whole community. We wanted to have a heterogeneous population in each small neighborhood. We did not want to have segregation by income. And so in our very first clusters, yours and the others, side by side, there were houses that were difference in price by $1 and $2, 50% higher and lower. A touching example of that, I'm reminded of a guy who lived up here, and he told me that he had moved from a town where he was in the second best golf club, and that immediately rang a little bell, a little resonance there, that the golf clubs were hierarchical. And he was thrilled because his neighbor was loaded, he thought. And yet they were communicating with each other. And when he went away, his neighbor watered his plants, this kind of thing. And so he said, and this is not apocryphal, he actually said it, you know, there are no Joneses here. to keep up with. And so that was an integral part of the philosophy of having different priced houses in different places so that people could stay in the same neighborhood if they wanted to. Know the same shopkeepers, the same ambiance. And the thing that's exciting now is that there are people who I know who have moved 4 times within Reston as their family size and fortunes have varied. And another thing that's very exciting is there's quite a movement now of young people who grew up here and who went out into the world and who are now coming back to raise their families.
I wanted to comment on that because before coming here, I came from a legislative meeting on social action. And one of the questions went to a discussion of land use and available housing stock throughout the county and basically what we do with some of our ordinances. And one of the things that a couple of us there in the meeting focused on was that when we build community, we don't separate the discussion of land use. And we actually build in all of that in what we're trying to do. And we're so fortunate here in Reston because that was the entire plan. And we have less of a tweaking to do to address some of our other issues because of how we developed here. And it also has given us the kind of continuity. And your last comment that you made is that as you go around this community now, you see the young families that have grown up here, and they see the continuum of their parents and them raising their children, and them seeing a real sense of what they were as a community growing up and why they want to be here. So we really alleviate a lot of the concerns and problems that we have outside of this community by the way we incorporated the land use issue here. And it wasn't a land use issue, it was a developing of the community, and we didn't separate those things.
This is something that I don't mean to keep going back to Hall Hills all the time, but I would like to try to make a point, perhaps it's editorial, but that's okay. That's the advantage of being a moderator, I suppose. When Goodman designed Hall Hills, he eventually had somewhere between 15 and 17 different unit types, and he had the same exact idea. Now, this again was in the late 40s. Recently, we celebrated our 50th anniversary as a community and had a gala dinner for about 500 people, which included second generation, third generation people living in the same community. There was an art exhibition in which very often there'd be mothers and daughters exhibiting. Is the torpedo factory. The point is, I think, that it's not just something that Reston shares and can take credit for. It happens to do with good design and good planning. It's that simple. When one recognizes the advantages of doing this kind of thing, as a planner, developer, and architect, these kinds of things happen. But design does have a lot to do with it, and a certain attitude about making a heterogeneous community, as Bob mentioned.
I want to comment about transportation, since that's my bag too, because Reston is particularly blessed by its design because it's the highest density node of housing outside of the Beltway, and its density makes possible the transportation, the bus transportation that we have, and perhaps eventually someday the rail transportation that we may have. But without the density provided by Hickory cluster, which saved the land, Waterview cluster, all of the open space that has been saved by clustering the housing, we'd have different lifestyles, and one of the different lifestyles would be a total absence of transportation, because you simply could not support bus transportation such as we have without the community designed with the density that it has, so that enough people live along the street to make it worthwhile to run a bus along the street. So we're particularly blessed as a community in that way, and we're blessed because we're the only community in Fairfax County, and the county Office of Transportation has tried diligently to remove this blight on our community, that is our Reston internal bus system. The community has fought vigorously for that bus system. It's appropriate. It means that those people who don't have, who can't drive, who don't have don't have a car, who do live here, who are neighbors, can get around the community, can get to jobs, can get outside of the community, and to places elsewhere in the Washington area. So we're blessed, not just because of the size of the kitchens and so on, but because of the density that we have. And Hickory cluster is certainly a classic example of excellent land use with 90 houses on 18 acres and a lot of open space. But it also makes possible the buses that run right by Hickory cluster and have run by that cluster since 1968.
I think maybe there's one statistic that you're not all familiar with and you might like to remember it, and that is in Reston, only 25% of the units are single-family detached. The rest are either townhouses or multi-story.
It's a good segue into another quote I wanted to make from Chuck Goodman's article in This is Reston that I mentioned earlier. As far as design of our townhouses is concerned, the site shaped the design. Our cluster is on a hillside rather than right on the lake, and we wanted to utilize that advantage, rather like an Italian hill town. We are varying basic shapes, square or rectangular, with different levels, roof terraces, balconies, each with a view of the lake. That's the excitement of a hillside cluster. In addition, the approach side of the houses is oriented to the village, while the other side is turned to the rural atmosphere, so you can literally have your cake and eat it too. You have the convenience of village life, but once you have stepped into your own personal environment, you are looking out into the country. Again, I'd like to just ask residents here, if that is indeed been your experience, how has the architecture and the actual planning of the clusters affected your viewpoint about living in the country? Throw it open to general discussion, if you could. Anyone has some nice recollections? Or are the windows large enough, for example? Yes, sir.
I'd like to put this as a question to Ms. Wayne. Do you think the vegetation, particularly the trees, in maturing has changed the rapport among the three blocks by starting to close off the sight lines? Does that change the dynamics and have the trees
Of
become?
course it does change the dynamics. And I walked in here late summer, and that was the first revisit after the cluster was completed in '64. And I was surprised how much shaded the buildings became, and I would suggest that you thin out the areas close to the houses, especially cutting out the saplings which have no chance of really growing. After all, you are not living in a wilderness forest. It should be a maintained forest. And
Let me get on the back of your horse and ride with you. I've done a little work with your cluster and it hasn't taken. I guess it was 1 or 2 years ago that I hoped to start something that I thought might be called the Saturday Morning Club. This is not something that's foreign to me. For years and years, I lived in a place where I could work with the trees and with the flowers and whatnot, and I enjoyed it enormously. I wouldn't now want to go back up a tree with a power saw, as I did at one time, and I don't recommend it to anybody. But knowing how to prune knowing how to cultivate, knowing how to thin out, knowing how to bring color. Your cluster has an infinite opportunity that has almost not been touched. And not only would this be a lot of fun for grown people, but it would be good for young people to do it whether they wanted to or not. Out of this would come color at least 6 months in the year that you don't have, and a healthier body, and an increase in the value of your properties. So I would love to see you get going on this. This is something I've been trying to do from the Reston Association point of view, and this also should be done at a cluster level. So I'm looking square at the guy I harassed, but he's been so busy with a bridge that
Bob, as an old Hickory cluster resident, let me put my foot in it and say that I'm a Ken Bonner fan. I believe that the wild space that Ken deserved around many of the houses he built in Reston is a wonderful asset, and I have delighted in the wildness of Hickory cluster. And I think they really ought to focus on their garage, and it's number one. A few other key issues. And forget about the Saturday morning gardening.
Ladies back.
Question. In designing our homes, was any thought given to the amount of glass in our homes and the fact that they were originally just single pane glasses, instead of double pane, and the heating problems that we have? I mean, I have taken my house and done.
I don't live here, but living in Holland Hills, we have the same question posed all the time. I think it's very important to remember that when these houses were, and I'm not going to make excuses, but when they were designed, energy was very cheap. And when you were cold, you simply put up a thermostat. And I'm really serious about this. The cost, first of all, the technology of glass at that time wasn't really that advanced as it is today with triple glazing and all the rest. So this is something that every modern house that has a lot of glass has to face.
But we also, I think, have a problem with trying to keep the standards, which today are almost impossible, because it then becomes, how do you go and put in commercial-sized windows in our homes at absolutely prohibitive costs? And I think a lot of people are finding that their houses cannot be heated, say maybe above 55. The wind is blowing from the north. I mean, I know one person who has a real problem, but because you have to stick to a standard of this wide window, which is a commercial window, you know, how do you get around this, that the house becomes comfortable and livable?
Are there any architects in the room?
What are you doing in Holland Hills?
In Holland Hills, many people have reglazed the windows. Now, they're not as large. They're 3 feet 1 is the original window module, so it's different.
That is what the problem is that we can't get an exception, so that instead of having, a 20-foot commercial window installed for every place, why not get an exception to that? I mean, what's the problem with
I think it's a good question and one that your board probably should pick up. I'm sure it hasn't before. I'm looking straight ahead. I don't know. I'm sorry. Over here and then over here.
You had originally asked this question, some of us, how do we enjoy living with these houses? As my husband said, we've been here almost 33 years, and we enjoy the big windows. We enjoy living practically outside when we're inside. That has been why we've stayed, because there obviously isn't too much storage space or garages or things like that, but we've stayed for this purpose. And I agree with Carl that the trees are lovely, they've grown, and that's why we're there. And I think I agree with you, we need to prune. Someone on the panel said it needs to be professional pruning, people who know what they're doing, because otherwise we can actually be destroying some of our assets. But the question I would like to ask and there's no one to ask now except you, Ms. Wayne, because you were there originally. It's really a point of interest. I'm not challenging this. I'm just wondering, when this cluster was designed, and when Mr. Goodman and you were designing it, what did you think about that underground garage that basically we're all dealing with now? Because no other cluster has that type of massive architectural, do you call it infrastructure, whatever, what did you think of it as you were designing it? Did you, and I mean this seriously as a question, how did you?
As far as I know, this was an effort to not only protect the cars, but primarily to put them out of sight. Goodman hated cars, really. He didn't want to see them. Holland Hills doesn't have a garage at all. Few people added garages, but he was really adamant against it. So this was one way to sort of hide the cars, and also don't forget that at that time people moving in these houses, they had full of kids. And the deck above the garage was meant as a safe playground area for the little kids. Not only the mothers at that time were living at home, most of them, and so that the kids also, after they went out of the play school, they were back home, and here they have this wonderful deck where there was no traffic, there was safety. The mother supervised them from the house. It was an ideal solution.
But in block 1 and 2, you have the parking behind the house.
I can't answer that question.
So maintenance in the future never came up, how we would maintain it?
The maintenance really was not considered, I suppose. The maintenance was left up to the future residents. I suspect, because you have got so many owners, said, oh, I thought you were driving, that kind of a thing. So I don't know how the structure worked, whether you had elected a representative who was responsible to watch out for the communal areas maintenance, or where this was left to the maintenance firm they hired to do the rest of the thing, which unfortunately never works too well. And that was the purpose for the deck, at least to try to utilize it as a playground.
Yeah, well, that was one of the missed opportunities that frustrate me. But the reason I grabbed the mic is I want to invite Carl to study the work of Capability Brown. He was perhaps the world's greatest landscape architect ever, and responsible for many of the wonderful estates in England. And when Capability Brown got finished with a place, nobody thought to say, oh boy, did you have a good landscape architect. They thought to say, God was in his heaven when this place was made. So that what I'm trying to talk about is your messy woods, as contrasted to the tree. I have to finish my sentence at least.
We're working on it.
Your extremely messy woods, where a few daffodils are trying to push their way up in the spring amongst the debris of fallen branches and trunks. So all I'm saying is if you walk through there and there was color in the spring, in the summer, in the fall, all kinds of things that grow naturally, the trees would be there. Nobody's talking about taking down the trees. When I talk about pruning, that's close into the house. Forget I said pruning. Just cleaning it up. I can tell by facial expressions if you don't like flowers. You don't like color. But most people like flowers. Most people like color. And you can't get it if you go to work on it.
I'm going to swiftly move to the right.
Well, since you came back to the subject of color, Bob says we don't have color 6 months out of the year because we don't have anything in the woods. I think at one time, when all the leaves fell off the trees, you must have been able to see some color throughout the cluster in our original color palette, which I'd like to...
About nature, not man.
No, I'm talking now about the color palette in the houses and how that was developed. Because I've always wondered about that. I'm very curious about it. Now when the leaves fall off the trees, we have what we refer to as the dung palette. Mostly browns. I wonder if you and Maria in particular could comment on how that palette came around. Not the dung palette, but the Mondrian palette. And maybe Carl could say how the dung palette came around.
This is an important question, I think, because I've been doing research in the Goodman archives for quite a few years now, and there are numerous drawings that show color patterns in these buildings. And obviously the buildings were the subject of enormous study on his part. I don't know what happened to them in terms of realization, but perhaps we can have you respond to that.
I'm afraid that I was the major culprit behind the colors because
This is Mrs. Mondrian here.
Yeah, I'm Mrs. Mondrian. I was in school, Gropius sort of teased me that I like the bunt, which in German means sort of colorful, but in a derogatory term. So I remember that very well, and I decided monochrome is going to be, but monochrome, not blah, muddy colors, but bright Mediterranean colors, hoping, of course, that it's going to look like a Mediterranean cluster poised over the Mediterranean Sea, you know. But unfortunately, the Virginia quality of light can't reproduce the vibrant colors of Mediterranean. And in addition to that colors, unfortunately, it's got a bad tendency of fading. And especially colors in the 60s were not nearly as impervious to weather as they are produced now. So if you are complaining about muddy colors, well, if they are not renewed every 3 years, that's what happens.
The paint was fine. It was the residents themselves who, as a committee, some will remember that, got together, a committee, people got together and decided they need to change the palette. So the original architect, the paints were fine, and you have to be very careful. Sometimes resident involvement is not all that is banged up to be, and I'm sorry that our supervisor is not here in that remark. It's because sometimes the architects and the professionals need to be listened to, and in this case, I think, they should have been.
Did someone else, I think some other hands were up earlier? Yeah.
We heard from Bob Simon that this concept in which we would have a music and dance pavilion and swimming pool and bathhouses and wading pools and anglers pools was a lot of fantasizing. But I suspect that Maria, as a site architect, must have had something to do with it, and I wonder if there are any good stories about this.
Well, you draw these kinds of plans and you enjoy the graphics. Making nice natural curves, it's a great joy, you know. And
You're giving it all away, Margaret.
sometimes these things happen and sometimes they don't, so you can always dream. But believe me, I think you have got enough problems with the cluster as it is. If you had to, on top of that, maintain a swimming pool and a dance pavilion and everything else, I think you would be out of business very shortly.
Any other comments or queries?
I have a question for Maria. Since the plans are to destroy the garage, would you be offended by destroying the garage? Because when I was going around and looking at all kinds of pictures, I suddenly discovered the whole lines of the garage and the whole place, and I really thought, boy, this adds a sort of architectural uniqueness to the place that is all gone when this ugly garage is destroyed.
I agree with you. Unfortunately, the reality, the financial realities are such that obviously you cannot rebuild it as it was. I'm sorry, I'm very sorry that it cannot be done, but because it really completes the architecture. There's no question about it. And the railing, as preposterous as it is, because being concrete, also because that was the cheapest way to do it. But it's such a very masculine, beautiful touch to the whole site. I'm really sorry to see it go.
Rather than a castle on a
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us how the entrance to the garage is shaped like a grand staircase? I mean, do you have any idea how that came about?
Well, the staircase was flanking the entrance to the garage, like you have very often these kinds of. In Italy, in the mountainous villages, you would have a fountain there. Here, in the 20th century, you have got an entrance to the garage.
I think I'll just weigh in with a couple of thoughts about, I know the garage, of course, is only the reason we're here. But it seems to me someone mentioned earlier that, of course, not all of the three areas have structured parking. Structured parking in developments like this is very costly initially. The most efficient way of dealing with cars is to simply let them gobble up the landscape with macadam and hot top, as they call it. My guess, and this is frankly only a guess, is that Goodman, as a relentless experimenter, he once called Holland Hills an architectural laboratory, and I suspect he'd use the same term for all of his work, particularly those involving residential agglomerations, such as Reston. I think it was an attempt to try to test, perhaps, a prototypical model. This was something that happens throughout much of Goodman's housing in River Park in southeast Washington, certainly in Holland Hills, in Houston House in Texas, and other such examples. He really did try to experiment with, I think, ideas that could be used in future projects, not unlike any, I think, architect's vision. Sometimes those experiments go well, sometimes they don't. But I think it's important to note that that particular strategy for hiding the car is not rampant throughout Hickory cluster. It happens to be in one part. My comment on the staircase that was posed before, in answer to the question, is I've always felt that it was simply a soft edge that is completely in counterpoint to the orthogonal, the right angle geometry to the rest of it, and that therefore the one sort of major pedestrian event, if you will, as you enter, he wanted to have some curves. So I think it was just a design counterpoint. Has always been my way of thinking about it. But again, I think this idea of a laboratory for experimentation. None of us wants to feel like a lab rat, of course, but we always, I think, have to take into consideration the benefits that such experimentation give us, along with the headaches. The question I'm hearing about trees, maintenance, I mean, where would we be if we don't maintain our body and maintain our automobiles? And very few people realize, I think, that when you consider architecture, the one thing that doesn't change for the most part is the building. What does change is vegetation and people. Trees do get larger, they get fuller, they grow up from little saplings, etc. So I think much of what I've heard today has to do with how do we address change, some of which we control, some of which we cannot. We try to, but in all cases we simply can't, I think. Are there any other, I have a closing comment, but I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't any other burning issue that might, yes?
Not so much an issue as, if you put aside the swimming pool pavilion and all of that, we did start out with more water. We had 2 retaining ponds in our open space area there. And I'm wondering if you, I know that it would be a pipe dream, but I understand we're talking to Mrs. Goodman about maybe helping the cluster. You know, the idea of enlarging, using our open space, keeping it open space, but enlarging that as a water vista for more of our homes so that we get the kind of panache that water view gets. Water view, not every house in water view has a view of the water, but it does sort of beef up the reputation there. I didn't ask that question to Maria.
I certainly don't object if you would try to open up the vista to see Lake Anne.
Well, I'm not saying Lake Anne. We have the one retaining pond. I understand we started with 2, which must have meant more water.
Well, as I explained to you, the ponds were never meant to permanently keep water in them. They were designed to retain water, excess water from the stormwater runoffs to prevent erosion and silting as much as it can for Lake Anne. If there is enough water supply for the pond to maintain them reasonably filled, by all means, go ahead and have them, because water is always great fun to have, provided you have good fish and frog there and whatnot to keep the mosquito larvae under control.
Yeah, you're probably right about the water supply. We had such a dry.
But it's the water supply. If you have to buy water from the community water supply, you would find out that you cannot afford it.
I'd like to ask each of the panelists then if they'd like to make a closing comment. Carl, would you like to start?
Well, I think Hickory Cluster residents who are here deserve a tremendous amount of commendation for dealing with an incredibly difficult problem, this garage problem, and the preservation of what this British architect who was referred to in the earlier comments. I'd heard that at the time this woman was touring Reston, that she was being brought around Reston by Bill Magnus, who some of you will remember as being the president of Gulf Reston. And Magnus had a very low opinion of Hickory Cluster because of the sales difficulties at Hickory Cluster. And he and the architect were coming down, this distinguished British woman coming down North Shore Drive, and all of a sudden she spotted Hickory Cluster and she said, "Stop!" She demanded that Magnus stop the car and get out, and she walked around Hickory Cluster and was absolutely delighted by it. And one day I hope that I'll walk around Hickory Cluster when all of this project is done again. Be delighted by it, and I hope to see many of you, and thank you for the courage and stick-to-itiveness that you've had. And I wish you all the best in completing this very, very difficult project.
I wish you good luck with your money collection, and believe me, you really have no choice. Because the value of your units depends on the quality of the surrounding. And if you have got in the midst of falling down a deck and unsafe conditions, it just is unsaleable. So I don't envy you, but I don't think it's the end of the world that it can be solved successfully.
I just want to second what Carl said. If you talk about finest hours, you all have created one of Reston's very finest hours. Shown what it is to work together in adversity and not look for an opportunity to pass the buck. So I congratulate you, and I certainly hope that the next couple of days, a few more will step up to that and complete the first phase of the project.
Thanks, Bob. I'd like to conclude with the following. Those of you who chose to participate in this true experiment in suburban living are all to be commended. For without your belief in the kind of creative enterprise envisioned by Robert Simon and designed by Charles Goodman, Hickory Cluster could not function, indeed it could not exist. The aphorism that it takes a good client to get a good building from a good architect has to be expanded when we speak of a community like Hickory Cluster. For without those like you in the audience who are attracted to a different way of living and a true belief in all of the benefits of that way of living, projects like Hickory Cluster can never embody the richness of life and community they are conceived to foster. In short, enlightened residents partake of, give back to, and make possible alternatives to conventional residential subdivisions. It's been a pleasure to join you this afternoon. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our organizers, the Friends of Hickory Cluster, and good luck on your fundraising efforts. The hat will be passed, I guess, later on at some point. But good luck. Thank you.